Hello everybody, welcome back to the ASUS ROG YouTube channel. This is JJ once again, and we're moving on now from the first part of actually our building X79 system video, and we're taking it to part 2. So we're at this point going to be focusing on some of the more kind of complex or specific parts of the installation process. Namely, the first one that we're going to be taking a look at is actually installing the CPU. Now there's some considerable differences when you're taking a look at the X79 platform and specifically the socket. So socket 2011. So we've actually got our X79 board here. We've actually got our CPU here, and we're going to actually be going through the process of actually, for one, removing the actual protective cover. Then from there, actually going through actually how you open up the socket, how you install the CPU, and how to make sure that you have that optimally installed without any issues. From there, then we'll proceed to go to our next steps, which will be focusing on CPU, cooler installation, as well as memory, and a couple of other specifics. So from here, let's go ahead and actually jump into installing the CPU into the motherboard. Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and start with the CPU installation process. This is going to be pretty straightforward. As we can see right here, we've got the actual socket, 2011 one socket right here, and we're going to go ahead and start off the install. So first and foremost, you can see actually we have the protective cover plate so that we don't actually accidentally make contact with the internal pins that are inside here, because of course when we take a look here at our CPU, there's no pins underneath it. We just have the pad. So we're going to go ahead and first go ahead, open this guy up and remove the actual protective cover. Now you could, if you wanted to, go ahead and pinch in at this point and try to lift up and out. Now, the problem and the reason why I don't recommend using that method is because sometimes you might have a slight mental slip, and as you're lifting you might angle inwards, and when you angle inwards you might inadvertently end up depressing down in on the pins and therefore damaging the socket. So I only advise actually removing the protective cover once we've actually lifted the actual retention plate. So let's go ahead and first do that. So we're going to first swing out from here. As we see, we're going to hold it down, swing out to the left, and then go ahead and allow this to lift up. Now that's going to stay stationary at that point, lifted. And we're now going to go ahead and move on the opposite side, take the other retention bar, same thing, hold it down, lift outwards, and then go ahead and lift up. At that point, we've now removed all pressure from the retention plate, and we're going to go ahead and lift it up. Now at this point, just as kind of like a secondary thing that I find a little bit easier in this process, is you can go ahead and bring this one back down and lock it back into place so that it doesn't bother you, and that one you can leave essentially there for right now. And at this point, just push out. So we'll go ahead and we'll do that one more time here. You can see right here, we're just going to take our finger and pop it out. That's it. Now don't throw this away. You know, you always want to keep this in the event that possibly something goes wrong. You need to RMA the motherboard or anything like that. You're going to always run into the situation, well, how would you protect the actual socket if you didn't have one of these? So you always want to keep this maybe inside just the motherboard box. So make sure to set this aside, okay? So at this point, you can see that we've gone ahead and locked this back into place. Now, if you want to, you could go ahead and once again leave this back out, but then the problem is that once we take our CPU, try to put it in there, you're going to see we're going to kind of have this obstructing, I think, a little bit of freedom that we want to make sure that we can go through the install process a little bit easier with. So we're going to keep that actually locked into place, keep the retention plate all the way out, and we're going to take our CPU. Now we can see that our CPU actually has 4 notches. This is very important because these are actually oriented and keyed specifically to fit actually within the CPU socket itself. So if we go ahead and we lift up our socket, we can see right there that we actually have the 4 notches. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. So at that point, we're just going to go ahead and take our CPU, and we're going to go ahead and drop this guy in here. I find it's a little bit easier for me to drop it in vertically as opposed to holding it horizontally. Find that horizontally it's a little bit harder. There's also, as if you can notice, there is actually some slight recessing that is on the top and the bottom that sometimes will make it a little bit easier for your kind of fingers to go down there, allow it to drop in so that you're not necessarily hitting an outer lip that would allow the kind of CPU to maybe dislodge from your hand prematurely. So at that point, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to go ahead and lift this guy back up. Okay, we're going to then make sure this guy's up. Going to bring the retention plate back down. We're then going to take the right hand retention bar, swing it back out, lock it into place. That's now locked in. At this point, you want to take the other retention bar and drop that into place. At that point, you've now successfully completed installation of your Ssd processor into your ASUS motherboard, and you're good to go ahead and proceed to the next step, which is beginning our actually CPU cooler installation process. Now with socket 2011, you've got a lot of different choices, just like you had actually for your previous generations. Really the choice comes down to do you do the classic standard air cooler, or do you go with a closed loop water cooling system? As for example, you can see there in our system where we selected the H60. We're going to go ahead and actually utilize an H60 once again. Our demonstration unit that we have here is actually an H100, but that's one of the great things. With the new actually socket mechanism that they have and the actual retention mechanism, it pretty much allows for a lot of flexibility. That pretty much all coolers that you're going to have on the market are going to utilize a very similar installation process. With previous generations, you usually had to use some type of backplate implementation for some of the larger coolers, and that won't really be the case. So if we take, for instance, here, we've actually got a standoff screw. This standoff screw is actually going to be one of 4 that will actually make contact with our CPU socket here. So we can see that we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4. So each one of those standoffs is going to go in there. We're going to go through the actual installation process so you can see exactly how that works out. And then we also, of course, have 4 thumb screws, which would actually go pretty much right on top of these guys, screw right in place, and you'd be good to go. So that's going to be pretty much standard for every single type of CPU closed loop cooler system that you look at. So whether that's an H60 or other products that are similar on the market. Now there are going to be some air cooling solutions that are, of course, already have the screws integrated within them. If that were the case, pretty much you would just put the actual cooler directly on top, you'd screw it down, finger tight, and you'd be good to go, and that's the end of the process. So overall, very simple. But from here, we're actually going to go ahead and jump on to taking our actually H100 and getting it installed on here so you can see actually how that mount process works out. So now that we've gotten ahead and completed our installation of our Sandy Bridge E processor, we're going to go ahead and move to the next step, which is installing our CPU cooler. Now there's going to be a couple of different options when it comes to installing the CPU cooler, whether you do this before the actual motherboard gets installed in the chassis, or in other situations you might do it with your cooler already installed in the chassis and then putting the board in after the fact. Taking into consideration the type of cooler that you're going to be utilizing will help you to know at which point you'll need to go through that installation process. Now you can see here that I have our Sandy Bridge E processor and I don't have any thermal compound on it. The main reason being is that for most of the new generation of coolers that are on the market, such as the H series units, they already come pre-applied with the thermal compound on the base, so we don't actually need to apply thermal compound. If it's something you're interested in though, make sure to check out our ASUS RG forums. We'll have more information for you guys that are interested in that. So at this point, what we're going to go ahead and do is take our standoffs. You can see that we have our standoff right here, and we can see that the actual threading is significantly longer on one side than it is on the other side. This thicker side right here is going to actually go directly into screw holes that are actually on the motherboard. So all we need to do at this point is pretty much just screw those in, and this would pretty much be the case for every type of closed water loop cooler that's going to be coming to the market. Most of them are all going to pretty much be using a very similar type of installation process with just pretty much 4 standoffs. And just make sure that essentially you get those installed all finger tight. Make sure that there is no exposed threading, so we want to make contact from the base of the actual screw to the base of the actual screw hole itself. Okay, so once we've gone ahead and done that, we don't use our thumb screws yet. We'll go ahead and bring over our cooler over, for example. So here we've got our H100, and this would be the same process for like an H60 or an H80, doesn't matter. And we can see here that this unit has 4 rings that are going to go directly over the actual screws. So we're pretty much just going to mount that on there. That sits directly in place. You're pretty much good to go. At that point, it becomes very simple. All you're going to do is take your thumb screws, let's screw that on into place. And same thing, you know, you don't want to necessarily go overtly over tight. I recommend finger tight, just because we don't want to sometimes apply too much pressure between the actual pin and the pad. So the pad being the bottom of the CPU and the pins being, of course, inside the socket. And I generally recommend also going angled in terms of the installation. So usually doing the bottom first and then the opposite angle next. And that reason why is just so we have some equal tension on both sides, as opposed to maybe going on this side and kind of have it bowing out on one end because of more pressure on one side of the actual socket than on the other. So at that point, pretty much you can already see that we've got a pretty firm grip in terms of having this cooler installed correctly. And keep in mind that for these type of units, while our motherboard has a lot of fan headers, there is an actual fan header option here so that you could go ahead and plug the actual fans directly into this and then control them via this. But since our motherboards already have exemplary fan control and we could do it directly from within the operating system or the UEFI, it makes more sense to go this route. So at this point, just go ahead and continue the thumb screws. So at that point, essentially just want to go back, double check, make sure that essentially all those thumb screws are finger tight, do a light little pull test, make sure that it's kind of essentially all sealed in place, and go ahead and you can lightly lift the board, make sure you don't see any discrepancies there, and you're good to go. And now we've successfully installed our cooler onto our actually Sandy Bridge eCPU, which has been installed onto our ASUS board. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next part with memory installation. Okay guys, we've gone ahead and successfully completed our CPU installation, our cooler installation. Next we're actually going to jump into the memory. Now in some situations it might make more sense to go ahead and install the memory once you already have it inside your chassis. It really just kind of depends on your setup. With our motherboards, as we can actually see, we actually do have what's called our QDIMM. Well, the great thing about this is that even if we did have a graphics card in here, the retention clips are not required in terms of being locked into place. So therefore it makes it very flexible in terms that even if we did decide to put the memory in after the fact and even after the graphics card was installed, it's not really that big of an issue. For us right now, we're going to go ahead and decide to do it outside the chassis just to go ahead and streamline the process a little bit more, so that when we go ahead and drop this in there, less to go ahead and get installed. Now one thing that you do want to keep in mind is, depending on the actual amount of DIMMs that you're going to install, there's going to be different memory banks that are going to be preferred for installation. Now you can actually see here on the board there is some silk screening. Take for instance, this silk screening right here is in reference to these 4 DIMM banks. So we have D2, D1, C2, and C1. Okay, and actually on the opposite end, you might not be able to see them. It says A1, A2, B1, and B2. Now, ideally, hopefully you're going to go ahead and take a look actually at your manual, which I've got right here. And you can actually see that there is some recommended parameters. So you guys can always make sure to just crack open your manual. In most situations, it's going to probably be pretty consistent to what you see here. And we actually have 8 DIMMs. So it doesn't really matter how we install our memory because it's going to be fully populated across the board. For you guys that are going to be considering only 4 DIMMs though, we can actually see right here, it is advising that we only use A1, B1, D1, and C1. Now this is important because that means it's asking us to go ahead and use the blue banks, not the black banks in terms of the memory. If you were to not follow this configuration, in some situations the board will not post. So you do want to make sure to reference the manual and make sure that you're going through the correct installation process. Okay? So let's go ahead and set that off there to the side. Let's take some of our Corsair Vengence right here and get ready to drop this in. Now we can see right here on the actual A and B side, in terms of the DIMMs, that we have actually notching for our 240 pin DDR3 module. So we can see here that here we have the notch. It's very simple in terms of what you can try to do initially is just angle it so that you can kind of get the perspective and make sure that you've got the notch in line. So we'll just go ahead and do 1 DIMM and show you that as an example. I try to minimize pressing in at the center, just because with some heat sinks, the more pressure you sometimes put at the center, you can take the actual thermal adhesive material that's on the inside and it can separate. So we don't want to necessarily put a lot of strain here, so I try to hold it here from both ends and push down, and that also is one of the reasons why it's a little bit easier to do this outside the chassis as opposed to when you're inside the chassis. So let's go ahead and just press that down, and it's pretty easy. Like you said, with the QDIMM we don't have to worry about the other side. That's latched into place. We now have the retention clip. It's gone ahead and hooked into the actual DIMM and the notch on the other end, so we're good. So that memory module is firmly installed. Now if we go ahead and go over to the other side, so our D2, C1, C2, and C1 banks, the actual notching pattern is reversed. So this is important because you wouldn't want to necessarily have your memory ready and go over here and then just go ahead and jam it in, because guess what? It's not going to actually install correctly. So what you need to actually do is once again reverse it, check your actually notching orientation, which we can see here. It aligns with the notch on the module, and you're good to go, and go ahead and drop it in and you hear that lock and you're good to go. So from there, if we were just to install the other modules, like I said, we want to go ahead and fill the 2 remaining blue banks in terms of the DIMMs. And one other last note is always be careful that when you're handling the memory, you want to minimize actually touching the actual exposed portion of the memory module, the traces in the PCB, this area. We've got sweat, we've got solvents on our hands, different things like that, and that can cause oxidation damage to that. So you always want to try to handle the memory directly by its heat spreader, or if you happen to have memory that doesn't have any heat spreaders on it, just try to handle it directly from the top. Okay, so that takes us through the actual memory installation process. Next up, we're going to be going over kind of some of the other specific ins and outs in terms of how to set up your system, how to install some of the other specific items for our X79 build. Alright guys, we've gone ahead and, as you've seen, successfully installed the motherboard inside of the chassis, so we're all good to go there. At this point, we're going to go through and go over some of the other kind of little aspects in terms of installation. So one of them is actually going to be a hard drive or SSD installation. So as we previously noted, we actually went with this Corsair chassis for the specific reason that we have toolless hard drives. So the great thing about that is that pretty much we can just slide these guys out, no screws required, and be good to go. So we're going to go over some of the different installation configurations you can go through. Now if you've got a chassis that maybe has this rotated and the actual hard drives go out horizontally, in most of those situations it's probably going to require that you pop off this front panel and either slide the hard drive in from the front or slide the hard drive in from the back, or something along those lines. Some of them also have these hard drive bays fixed. These aren't removable, and it would require you to slide in the hard drive from the back as well. But with the chassis that we've gone ahead and selected, we're good to go. Now, one of the great things that we can see here that Corsair has done with this toolless option is that it actually already has mounting holes for our SSD. So you can see here we have our 120 gigabyte SSD, and we've essentially just screwed it right here, and we're good to go. Now, one of the great things that we can do at this point too is that if we want to go ahead and mount it, at this point we could just go back in, and you can pretty much actually mount it either way. So we go, excuse me, here from the top, or we could go ahead and go the other route, flip it over, and have it go in that route. Now from here, if we, let's say, wanted to go ahead and add our mechanical hard drive, you're going to actually see that there's four screws, excuse me, four threads for 4 different screws on each side of the drive. And if we then take a look here, you can actually see here that there's actually pre-fit screws in place. So those are right there. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're just going to go ahead and take the hard drive. We're going to position it into place here. Make sure essentially it just goes into those little fittings, and just lift the lip up on the other side, and that's it. We've actually mounted both the SSD and the hard drive at the same time. Then go ahead and slide it in, and you'd be good to go. So it's a very simple process, and if you didn't want to have both of them, of course, attached at the same time, then you could go ahead and just select one or the other. And that would generally be in a situation where maybe you would find that the cable configuration in the back end wouldn't be easy for you to go ahead and route that, because you would have to have no right angle connections. They'd all have to be flat. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, another option that you're going to have depending on your chassis is actually going to be a little bit different. Most of the SSDs that come on the market come with some type of actually 2.5 inch to 3.5 inch adapter. So as we can see right here, so the purpose of this would be is that once again, if we pull one of these guys out, we would go ahead and be able to mount this actually onto here, and you could go ahead and use one of these type of adapters. So it just depends on your type of chassis, your type of configuration. These are very simple in terms of how you would work with it. So you can see that there's 4 mounting holes. Your SSD has 4 mounting holes. Go ahead and put your SSD on there, and go ahead and line up the threads as so. And from there you would go ahead and put in 1, 2, 3, 4, and then go ahead and put that in, and you'd be good to go. So that gives you a quick little overview in terms of actually how you would successfully install either a standard mechanical 3.5 inch hard drive, or a 2.5 inch SSD. So we've gone ahead and successfully completed the installation of our SSD and our hard drive, which gives us our SSD caching configuration. Next up is actually some other form of storage, which is actually our ODD. So here we actually have our Blu-ray ODD writer, and we're actually going to go through the installation process. This one actually really couldn't be simpler. Once again, with the toolless chassis configuration that we have here, this Corsair Carbide 400, we're good to go. Now you can see here that the actual ODD has 8 screw holes, 4 on this side and 4 on the other side, and that would be for your older generational chassis that are sometimes going to require that as you slide this drive in, that you're going to go ahead and have to screw 4 screws on each side and be good to go. Some users don't necessarily use all 4. Some of them just might use 1 in the bottom and then 1 in the top position diagonal, so that you go ahead and have an even balance, which is kind of key to make sure that you don't get over vibration with your ODD. But in our situation, it's very easy. So at this point, all we're going to need to do is just take our ODD, and you're going to want to pop out the front part of the chassis in terms of the bay that's locked in place. We're just going to slide it back, and it locks into place. And as you can see there, this actually lock has already automatically just locked the drive into place, and we can't move it. It's locked there in place. And if we wanted to go ahead and remove it, we essentially just lift out, and it would slide back out. So once again, just locks back in place. As a quick kind of reference, before you usually want to have this in place, you want to make sure that you routed 1 power lead in terms of the Molex connection through the back and into here, as well as a serial ATA cable running from the motherboard, so that you could essentially, once you have that completed, essentially just clip in the connection, clip in the power, and you ODD would be good to go. And that's it. Simple, straightforward ODD installation. Alright guys, we've gone ahead and gone through most of the installation process, so now we're going to talk a little bit about fan configuration and installation. So as we initially detailed when we first talked about the chassis and why we selected it, is that we wanted a chassis to give us a lot of airflow. So with this Carbide 400, we have the ability to put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fans, right? So the next option that comes into consideration is, well, how do we set these fans up? As we kind of detailed a little bit originally, that we want to make sure that we had cool airflow coming in contact with the actual motherboard, and specifically the heat sinks and the VRM. So we've gone ahead and selected 2 Cooler Masters 120mm Excaliber series fans, and these guys are actually going to be positioned to draw in air and pull it down and actually have it blowing directly across not only all our DIMMs, but the foreground of the board, so the VRM heatsink, and then the back plane of the VRM heatsink. So that gives us a lot of flexibility in that regard. Now, a couple of things to take in consideration is going to be your fan choice. For one, we do recommend a 4-pin fan because that's going to give us the ability to have it be controlled by the motherboard, whether it's in the software or whether it's within the UEFI. Plus, some fans are going to be better designed than others. Like here, we have an open frame allowing us to draw more air. We also have an actual customized actually fan blade, which allows us to go ahead and cut in a little bit more and be able to draw more air in. Now, you're also going to have some things that are considered accessories that come with your fan, such as the installation method. So these fans actually come included with a silicone grommet, which is essentially a replacement for a normal screw. So as you can see here, if we draw this in, pretty much draws through, and that makes the installation process very simple. With this chassis, it actually also has rubber fittings that also is a secondary mechanism to absorb vibration and go ahead and eliminate any type of actually noise that might occur, especially at lower noise levels. So that's a great option. Now, when you compare that to, let's say, your standard option, which would be something like this, which would be a regular screw, you'd go ahead and drop that guy in there, you'd have a nut and a washer probably, and you would be good to go, and that would be your install process. So from here, we're pretty much just going to show you kind of some of the options that you have in terms of installing this. So as we said, originally we want to go ahead and have this draw in air and blow this down, so we're going to go ahead and install it like this. And if you notice, what I've already done here is I've actually already done all my cable management there at the top in terms of tying the cables, and that's done specifically for the reason that you want to try to give yourself as little length as you need to when you're positioning this in there, with a little bit of leeway, so then that way it's not harder in terms of trying to position all your cables, have it be routed, and trying to adjust it, pull it in after you've already positioned the fan in there. This makes it, I think, a little bit easier, that just give yourself just enough in terms of rotating it in there, you're going to be good to go. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and slide this in here. And there's going to be 4, of course, holes, and we're essentially just going to get these lined up, and we're just going to drop in these silicone grommets, and I'm not going to thread them all through yet. I'm just going to kind of get them all in place. It's very simple. Once I have those in place, All I need to do is just pull through on the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4. Doesn't get easier than that, guys, in terms of a fan installation, and plus now we also have a great configuration that gives us a lot of air cooling potential, and it's also going to be quiet regardless of the rate that you go at. Now, for some of you guys that are even looking at greater airflow options, this chassis does also support 140mm options, so you could use something like this Sigmatech, which is a fantastic design, which gives us actually the ability to do not only 120mm mounting, but as well as 140mm mounting, and this would be the same exact type of configuration. You would go ahead and pull that in and go ahead and either take your screw and slide it through, or go ahead and take your silicone grommet, slide it through, and have it mounted. So a lot of options when it comes to fan installation. Alright guys, we're going to take a look at one other aspect here in terms of considerations when building your system, and how to consider actually installing a specific item, and namely that item is actually our power supply. Now with power supplies, there are a couple of things to take in consideration when you're putting this into a chassis. One is, of course, you want to take in consideration, does the unit actually have modular leads? We can actually see here that with our power supply, this Corsair AX750, it has modular leads, so actually we could go and pre-route all the cables, have them fitted and to essentially just meet us up right here in the bottom portion of the chassis, and essentially just link those up and be good to go. So that's flexibility there, with of course having a power supply that has the leads already pre-attached, that you wouldn't necessarily have that flexibility. You'd have to get this in there and then kind of route everything in place. So that is an important consideration. Another consideration is that what's the type of airflow configuration for this actual PSU. Now we can see here this actual PSU has an actual fan right here. Now this fan actually will very rarely run because of the high efficiency of the PSU, so in most situations this is actually going to be almost inaudible. Some power supplies though are going to be a little bit different, where they actually might have maybe like an 80mm fan here that's exhausting outwards. So of course you might need to make sure that you have that fan positioned outward to go in that regard. Other ones won't of course have a fan here in this position, it's just going to be here, and some actually you might even have both. It really just depends. In our specific chassis situation, depending on how we're setting this up, we could actually kind of go a couple of different routes. One, we could just mount this in place, and it sits on top of these nice rubber grommets that help to absorb vibration to minimize actually the noise footprint, and we'd essentially be good to go, and we just would connect our leads and we would be set. Now of course the fan itself isn't going to necessarily be doing anything because we've blocked it off, although at the underside of the chassis there's still going to be a little bit of static buildup, so of course you still might actually get dust that's coming inwards, which if that's the case, if you have a nicer chassis, there's going to be what's referred to as a removable dust filter. You can pull that guy out, clean that guy off intermittently, and make sure that essentially you're still being able to draw a little bit of air in and help ensure the long-term reliability of the power supply. Now the other option of course is we could take this guy back out. We could actually flip it like this, and we could have it set up in this configuration. Now depending on whether the actual power supply is drawing air in from the actual chassis, so if it's drawing air in and then exhausting it outwards, that'd be a great consideration, because of course as the hot air is being produced in this area, especially with our GPU building up heat, we can go ahead and draw it down and exhaust it outside of the chassis. Just all depends actually on the actual PSU design, so make sure to take consideration the actual PSU that you're utilizing. Read the manual if you need to find out actually how the airflow configuration works on your power supply in question. And for our configuration, I think we're going to go ahead and go with this option, and we'll leave this enabled so that we can go ahead and have this really nice great design in terms of airflow. So we're drawing the cool air in, exhausting here in the secondary air chamber. We're bringing in this cool air from the front, exhausting it through, cooling our hard drives, bringing it here, helping to push back and then draw back out of the chassis. So this works out well. At this point from there, just go ahead and connect your power leads as you need to this modular PSU, and you're good to go. Alright guys, we've gone ahead and finished up most of actually our installation here, so we're going to go ahead and go to one of the smaller aspects of actually chassis installation, but really a critical one and something that ties everything together. So in the front of our chassis, of course, we have things like the power button, we have the reset button, power LED, hard drive LED. These actual leads that come from the front of chassis normally would plug directly into the motherboard and allow you to go ahead and have those items be functional and operational. But what we do here have is actually our little patented Q connector. This makes it a little bit easier. So we're going to go ahead and run these leads first to here, and then we're going to go ahead and put them into the board. makes it a little bit easier in terms of not being so cramped at trying to run these individual heads to the actual leads on the actual motherboard. So we're going to go ahead and take now power switch, get this guy into place. Let's go ahead and put the power switch in there. Next is we're going to go ahead and do reset. So we've got reset there. Then we're going to have, let's see, hard drive LED. Now with hard drive LED, we can see right there we actually have a plus and a minus, and we've got a plus and a minus here as well. So we need to make sure and match those up. Got those matched up. So we've got reset, power, and hard drive LED. And then on the opposite end, we have power LED. So power LED, just like hard drive LED, we have some options that we need to make sure are lined up. So we've got minus, and then we have plus. Okay, now that we have those all fitted in place, we're all good to go. So we're going to go ahead and take this guy and turn it in here and fit it in. And there we go. So we've gone ahead and successfully attached the Q connector to the bottom right hand corner to the leads on the motherboard, and we're all set, good to go. As always, guys, if you guys enjoyed the video, please make sure and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, make sure to drop them here on the YouTube page or hit us up on Twitter or Facebook, and always head over to ASUS ROG forums.